Hey everyone, welcome to this week's edition of Title Scoop. So this week we are continuing our talk on joint tenancy, and it's actually going to go into next week, I realized, because I had more examples and situations I wanted to talk about, and I don't want to make the video too long. So last week we talked about the basics, right? We talked about that in order to create a joint tenancy, we needed, one, our state to recognize it. It had to be created by a grant of deed or conveyance. Can't be implied, right? The intentions have to be really clear and unambiguous. And then we also need at least two people. So I don't know if I stated that clearly last week, but if I didn't, you always have to have at least two people to create a joint tenancy with a right of survivorship, because one person can't hold tenancy that way. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the common law doctrine. So one of them is the four unities of title, which is of joint tenancy. And the four unities are time, title, interest, and possession. Now, all this means is that all the owners had to take title at the same time via the same title instrument with equal ownership interest, and then each having a right of possession. So those are the four unities. Additionally, the document that was conveying to the parties needed to be really specific that it was joint tenancy. Now, that joint tenancy could be severed if any of those four unities was broken. So time, title, interest, possession. Again, I don't know that this is going to come up. I just thought it was interesting as background on the history of joint tenancy. Now, at common law, joint tenants generally could not be a non-individual. So that means a corporation, LLC, trust, partnership, they could not hold as joint tenants. What I will tell you is in my research, I found there are some states that do allow non-individuals to hold as joint tenants. Now, there are specifics of how that happens. There is at least one state that allows LLCs, and it's very specific that the operating agreement has to have survivorship language within it. I know of at least one state where trusts, as long as it's a husband and wife, it's a revocable trust. Their trust agreement does have to be specific, but they can hold as joint tenants with right of survivorship. So again, you're just going to want to know. One other example, I do know of at least one state where an individual could hold it with their trust as joint tenants with right of survivorship. And then when they pass away, it goes to their trust. So again, if you have that scenario and you're not sure, you're going to want to either research your state law or call your underwriter to see if you can actually do it. Now, as we have discussed, joint tenancy can be created via deed of conveyance. However, what happens if I hold property myself and I decide I want to create a joint tenancy? Well, so at common law, interestingly, you had to create that. They didn't view it, if I conveyed directly to, say, myself and my brother as joint tenants, they would say that wasn't actually a valid conveyance and we didn't hold as joint tenants. Instead, we had to have a straw man or an intermediary. So I would have to convey to, say, this straw man, and then the straw man would convey to myself and my brother as joint tenants with right of survivorship. Now, I did a little research to try to figure out if that existed anywhere anymore, because most states say a direct conveyance is a valid conveyance and it conveys joint tenants with right of survivorship. So if you are a state that still requires that intermediary or straw man, shoot me an email. I'm really curious what states still actually require it. But the one thing to say is if you have to do that, or if you do that, you're going to have to check liens on that straw man, because they are entitled, even if it's only for a millisecond. So the last thing we're going to talk about is the survivorship doctrine, because I think it's sometimes misunderstood. And it's really short, but the one thing I will say is the survivorship doctrine doesn't happen until there's only one joint tenant left, right? So if there's three of us in title as joint tenants with right of survivorship, one passes away, we now hold as joint tenants with right of survivorship. So the right of survivorship, again, doesn't happen until the last person is living and everyone else is dead. So when this sort of comes into play, and two scenarios where you might actually go, wait, I don't know how to handle this, are simultaneous deaths, and then if the surviving tenant is the person who murdered the other joint tenants. So I know that sounds crazy, but it does happen from time to time. And when we get those questions, we have to pull up the statutes and the case law to see how it's handled, how they determine, one, whether the person actually is the survivor and whether they get to stay in title, or if something has to happen, or on a simultaneous death, how it's determined how the person was last in title. So who was the last tenant in title. So that's it for this week. Next week, we're going to talk about a few more title issues, underwriting issues surrounding joint tenancy, and then ways that it can be terminated or severed. So have a great day, and we will see you next week.